Just ahead on American Black Journal, we'll explore the legacy left by President Abraham Lincoln as the nation marks the 150th anniversary of his assassination. Our special guest is award-winning writer Doris Kearns Goodwin, author of a best-selling book about Lincoln, plus a look at Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation that freed millions of slaves. Stay right there. American Black Journal is next.
At DTE Energy, we believe that we have a greater responsibility. We believe that being part of a community means being involved in the fabric of that community, investing time, effort, and resources in the communities we serve. DTE Energy Foundation is a proud sponsor of American Black Journal.
Welcome to American Black Journal. I'm Stephen Henderson. This month marks the 150th anniversary of the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. The theater chair that the president was sitting in when he was shot is part of the permanent collection at the Henry Ford in Dearborn. For the anniversary, the museum hosted special events reflecting on Lincoln's legacy, including a lecture by Pulitzer Prize-winning author Doris Kearns Goodwin. I had the privilege of sitting down with Goodwin to talk about her best-selling book on President Lincoln. Doris Kearns Goodwin, welcome to American Black Journal.
Thank you.
I want to start with discussion of your book, Team of Rivals, which of course is the basis for the movie Lincoln. The movie focuses on sort of the end of the book, the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. The book itself starts far before that, with Abraham Lincoln waiting to see the results of the Republican primary in 1860. And it starts with such a vivid painting of what he's doing. He's in his law office in Springfield. I think at some point you have him eating an apple. It's the kind of narrative prose that you would think would come from eyewitness accounts, and yet you're a historian and were able to put together that much detail about what happened. Tell me about the process of knitting all of that together.
Well, you know, the great thing about going back to that period of time is that all these characters wrote letters and they kept diaries.
Right.
So you do have that written evidence of what people were thinking and feeling, what they ate, what they did, where they went. And that's not going to be true 200 years from now about us. We'll know much more how we looked, how we talked. They'll see pictures and they'll see emails maybe, but those long epistles that Seward would write to his wife or Chase to his daughter, they just won't be there.
Right.
So that's what I think allowed me to get inside of it. But the reason I chose to have all of these guys together waiting for the news of who had gotten the nomination and then go back was because there's so many books had been written about Lincoln. I knew I just couldn't write a regular biography on him.
Sure.
So at first I thought I'd write about Abe and Mary because I'd written about Franklin and Eleanor. But then when I saw how much time he was spending with these guys in his cabinet, I realized he's married to them almost more than Mary. And then I got so interested in them. They were all fabulous characters in their own right.
And the theme, the title of the book is Team of Rivals. It really sort of goes through how he transitions from trying to beat these guys in the election to pulling them all back together at a really pivotal time in U.S. history to have them guide the country through the Civil War.
Yeah, it was an amazing decision, and he really made it the night he won the election. He said he couldn't go to sleep, and he realized that he needed people to help him because he had only had such small experience before he became president. He'd been in the state legislature, one-term congressman, lost twice for Senate. And so he decided that here was Seward, his chief rival, governor and senator from New York, Chase, another rival, governor and senator from Ohio, Bates, the elder statesman from Missouri. And people said, why are you doing this? You're going to look like a figurehead. They're all more powerful than you. And it was true. They were all more educated, more of celebrities. Each one of them thought he should have been president instead of Lincoln.
Sure.
But he said, the country's in peril. These are the strongest and most able men in the country. I need them by my side. So it was a great decision, his very first decision that he made as president, to surround himself with powerful people.
Right, and of course his presidency is baptized in cannon fire, immediately plunged into the Civil War, and a series of very tough decisions about how to guide the country through that, but also how to end slavery, which becomes, of course, the central the central theme of his presidency. In 1863, he signs the Emancipation Proclamation, which is very controversial at the time, not just because it's about slavery, but also because it's an enormous exercise of executive power.
So.
That's something that it seems like we have been struggling with since the Constitution was written. Where's that line between what the president can do and what he has to wait on, sometimes a very reluctant Congress, to help him with?
You are absolutely right. I mean, even at the beginning, while he would have wished to deal with slavery when he first entered the war, he knew that he didn't have the power as president because slavery was protected by the Constitution, saying that property was protected in the South. So he's just at the beginning went for keeping the Union together. That was his message in the inauguration. It's what he did the first couple of years, even though people were saying you have to do something about slavery.
Yeah.
It was only when he finally realized that as commander-in-chief, he had extraordinary powers that he wouldn't have simply as president. And the African Americans were being used by the Confederates in building trenches, in cooking, in helping the cause. So he knew that he could argue that war necessity allowed him to take this huge step of an executive order for an Emancipation Proclamation. But it was what he would have liked to have done even earlier had he come to a position in the war where he knew it could be legitimized.
Right. In the book and in the movie, there's such a warm, personal portrait of this president, and I thought you did such a wonderful job of showing how these decisions sort of visited on him personally. They were not easy, and he sat with them a long time and often went back to them and thought, boy, was that the right thing to do? That, again, is something that I think we see all the time with presidents.
I know sometimes when you know that it all turned out all right, you know, that the Union won and slavery was ended and the war was a victorious one, you forget that he often said that if he'd ever imagined the tension he would live under from the time he won the election until they made the decision to rearm Fort Sumter or send the food down, he wouldn't have thought he could have lived through it. That looking back on it later, it was awful. And I think that's what makes him so accessible to us, is that he was vulnerable. He did have his sadnesses. He had his great sense of humor. I mean, when I was working on the movie with Tony Kushner, what mattered to me more even than whatever story they chose to illustrate him was what kind of character is he going to come across as. And I thought Daniel Day-Lewis just perfectly portrayed the Lincoln that I knew, even to the point of walking like Lincoln walked, like a laborer coming home at the end of a hard day, and telling those funny stories. I kept teasing them, you have to put humor in, because that was a big part of the way he whistled off sadness, as he said, through his funny stories. And they did it. And when I first saw the clip of the movie, actually the first group cut of it at Steven Spielberg's house, I came away thinking I wasn't even watching a movie. I was watching Lincoln.
You were watching
walking
him
and
on
talking.
screen,
It was so exciting.
Wow. This year, 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War, also of President Lincoln's assassination. What are the things that modern leaders might look back at to sort of borrow from Lincoln?
Well, you know, I think when you think of the dysfunction of the Congress now and that neither side can even talk to one another, the reason the 13th Amendment was an important story to tell in the movie, as well as a shorter story in my book, was the fact that Lincoln was able to get people for a good cause by all sorts of means. I mean, nowadays they might be transparent. You know, I'll give you this if you'll come with me on this. I'll bargain this if you come with me. And he did it. He did all the things as a politician necessary through persuasion and through hard bargaining to get the right votes to pass that 13th Amendment.
Right. I want to transition just a little. I know you also know quite a bit about Lyndon Johnson. We're coming up on the 50th anniversary here of the riots in this city, which really did tear this city apart, and whose legacy is still a very big part of our modern lives in Detroit. Lyndon Johnson had to respond to that by sending the National Guard, but I also know that it happened at a time in his presidency when he was struggling with his own legacy in terms of civil rights and what effect that would have on his domestic programs and things like that. Talk to me about what he would have been feeling at the time those riots happened.
Well, I know because I started working for him as a White House fellow right after the riots took place in Washington a year later. And what he was most proud of for his legacy forevermore would be civil rights. the Civil Rights Act of '64 that desegregated the South, the Voting Rights Act of '65, open housing. And so what happened when the riots took place in Detroit and earlier in Watts, right after the Voting Rights Act, and then later in Washington, was it was so hard for him to understand, because he thought, we've made such progress and things are still a long way to go, but huge victories have taken place. And I think part of it was that expectations do get aroused. And sometimes these things just had random sparks that had nothing to do with anything.
Sure.
But I think he almost took it personally. I don't understand why is there not a sense
What is
of
that
fulfillment?
frustration about?
What and he tried to understand it, but I think he took it personally, as if they're rioting and we just did this. And
Right.
and it was, as you suggest, a harder time in his presidency. By '67, the war was engulfing a lot of his domestic accomplishments. It's what's so interesting with this 50th anniversary coming up in Detroit. There's also been the 50th anniversary of the voting rights speech, 50th anniversary of civil rights last year. Medicare will be this summer.
Right.
So he is getting his due finally.
That's all Johnson.
It's all Johnson. He was the most formidable, interesting character. I mean, I became a presidential historian because of that experience of working with him. And I don't think any president I could have known would have been as interesting, as unusual and colorful as he was.
Sure. You know, in the movie Selma, which came out last year, he is depicted in a way that that I would say, from reading histories of him and from listening to a good number of the tapes that have been released of him in the White House, was not how I expected him to be depicted. I mean, there was a controversy over his reluctance to come along on the Voting Rights Act. More than that, to me, he is depicted almost as a cowering figure who is, almost afraid of his own shadow. He's complaining about protests outside the White House gate. That's not the person that I remember reading about, who has just won re-election by the largest margin in U.S. history and passed the Civil Rights Act. This was a gigantic Lyndon Johnson who was still very much a bully in Washington, right?
No, you're so right. I think they missed a huge opportunity by making Lyndon Johnson not the person that he was, because they unfairly said that he had taped Martin Luther King. That wasn't true. John Kennedy had done it. And yes, maybe he worried at the beginning what the timing of everything was. But once the Selma thing happened, he was out there for that "We Shall Overcome" speech, which I'm happy to say my husband was part of working on that speech.
Right?
And it's the most beautiful speech, I think, in that whole decade, when Johnson understands the importance of capturing the civil rights anthem and allowing the social movement from below to push him to do the things. It was a transcendent American moment. That's what made it sad in the movie. It doesn't have to be a black moment or a white moment. It was an American moment.
Sure.
And they had all the chance to do those great marches. The cinematography was terrific. But by not giving Johnson his due, it just wasn't fair historically. And I think they lost out on certain kinds of awards that they might have won because of stirring up that controversy.
Yeah. You said something earlier in the interview I want to come back to, that in the future it will be harder for people to piece together so much of who somebody was who might have been president, because they've gotten away from the kind of journal keeping and letter writing that they had. Do you worry about that? Do you worry about your work, the kind of work that you do, and people who will come behind you? How will they be able to tell the stories that we need told?
Yeah, I think the harder thing for them, they'll have much more stuff, as I say. They will have, when we were working on the movie, we only knew that Lincoln walked that way because somebody had written that down. We knew that he had a high-pitched voice because somebody said he did.
Said that,
But
right.
now you'll be able to hear the person talking, you'll see them walking. But will you know their emotional relationships to the decisions they're making, to their families?
Right.
When people wrote letters in the old days, that was their only means of communication. Somebody's gone for 6 months. You can't call them on the phone. You can't email them. So everything comes out. And there's nothing more extraordinary than reading over the shoulder of somebody who's written a handwritten letter or a diary.
Right.
So I think it'll be hard for people 100 years or 200 years from now to, first of all, separate all the stuff that's out there, much of which isn't going to be valuable,
Right.
and to not have that written word. So I'll never go forward in history. I'm always going back.
Yeah, go back.
I'm
right.
going back.
Lastly, what about Barack Obama? Put him in the context of the presidents that you know best, Johnson, Lincoln. I always say that these presidents' legacies won't be forged for years after they are gone, but certainly his place in history is obvious now.
No, I think it's true in general. It takes a generation to really look at, for example, how much of the economy, which is now turning around, does he get credit for? Certainly the fact that he's the first African-American president, and that moment when he won, and there was such euphoria in the country, because I think the country felt we have come through another step.
Absolutely.
And so that will always be with him. And he'll write a pretty good memoir, I suspect.
I suspect that because he's a young man, one of the topics I've been always very interested in is presidents who are young when they leave the office, or young enough to do something else of significance. Jimmy Carter, I think, is the immediate person who comes to mind. Barack Obama, I think, also has an opportunity to forge a much bigger legacy than other presidents may have had.
No, I think there's no question in modern day, ex-presidents have a lot of power. They have resources, they have access to the media, much more than they did 200 years ago.
Sure.
And if you're younger, usually they're dying, given the old age of the, people dying younger in the old days. He could have half a life left.
Yes.
So you're right. And I think, with the Jimmy Carter example, I think presidents realize that their legacy is not simply over the moment they leave the White House. And all of them that are in there are thinking about, how do I stack up against Washington, Lincoln? It's inevitable. It's your last competition, right?
Sure.
So hopefully that leads them to want to use that platform to make a difference in people's lives and to do good things. And I hope he will.
What about Hillary Clinton? She has announced that she's going to seek the presidency. That would be a number of firsts. First former spouse, former first lady, to seek the presidency. First woman. That would be a lot of change very fast. First African American, followed by the first woman. Is there something that's happening in the culture that is moving us ahead faster than normal?
I think you're right. I mean, I have a feeling that this time Hillary's being a woman will have even more impact. It's odd to say that. I mean, obviously she was a woman 8 years ago, but she didn't stress it all that much. And we had that extraordinary moment of the first African-American running against her. But it's about time that there's a woman in the presidency. We've had such a bad record compared to so many other countries.
Sure.
And I think it'll give her a special kind of power if she uses it in the campaign, and if she is able to connect to people and learn from the mistakes of her past campaign. I mean, she certainly had lots of experience, and the question is, how much do you learn from that experience? But I think the fact that it's going to be a woman, more than you realize. I mean, somehow I remember when the first woman vice president, Geraldine Ferraro, was put in. And I was sort of watching it, and it seemed interesting. I woke up the next morning, I said, wow, this is exciting. And I think people are going to feel this front-runner candidate. This time the focus will be on the barrier that she might break. And whether that's enough to change the politics of the country, I don't know. But it'll be interesting to see. You're right. And if that follows the first African-American, then we can have the first Jewish president and the first Hispanic president. And it's all open ground.
Right. I mean, it seems like that's those are barriers that stood for so long and seem to be insurmountable. I can remember writing a column in 2007 about how the Democrats almost had no chance to win the presidency in 2008 because their two choices seemed to be a black man and a white woman.
So much for your predictions.
That's right. The country just was not ready for that. And to imagine that, it was ready, obviously, for Barack Obama, and it may be ready for Hillary Clinton.
Social change is happening so quickly now. I mean, when you think about the gay movement and how far that has come. I mean, who would have guessed 4-6 years ago that gay marriage would be accepted in lots of states and in large parts of the country?
Right.
Even with people politically conservative, I think social movements have created a certain kind of openness toward people's lives, which is a very good thing, I think.
Yeah. Okay, Doris Kearns Goodwin, thank you very much for being here.
Oh, you're welcome. What a pleasure to talk to you.
Just ahead on American Black Journal, we'll continue our look at President Lincoln's legacy with a special video on the Emancipation Proclamation, courtesy of the Henry Ford Museum. That's next, right after this look at some important moments in Detroit's Black history.
I'm Kim Trent with a look back at African American life in Detroit. This week in 1942, Roy Lightfoot, Paradise Valley's first mayor, died at the age of 46. In 1989, the Detroit Lions selected Barry Sanders of Oklahoma State University with their first-round National Football League draft pick. And in 1970, Freda Payne's hit Band of Gold was released. These are significant events this week in Detroit's Black history, taken from the book On This Day, African American Life in Detroit.
One of President Abraham Lincoln's most important executive orders was issued on January 1st, 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation freed 3 million slaves as the bloody Civil War entered its third year. The proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states were free then and forevermore. The original document is housed in the National Archives in Washington, but in 2011 it was loaned out to the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn for 3 days. Nearly 22,000 people stood in line for up to 8 hours to view Lincoln's proclamation. Here's an excerpt from a video about that historic document, courtesy of the Henry Ford and Motion Possible.
On December 1st, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln addressed Congress. At that time, he had no way of knowing if his countrymen or the world would accept his proclamation. In giving freedom to the slave, he asserted, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. We shall nobly save, or meanly lose, the last best hope of earth. Other means may succeed. This could not fail. The way is plain, peaceful, generous, just. A way which, if followed, the world will forever applaud, and God must forever bless. We will never truly know Abraham Lincoln's personal motivation for crafting the Emancipation Proclamation, and perhaps his reasons are of no consequence today.
I get leadership lessons from Abraham Lincoln. I don't always look at him in terms of, the person who freed the slaves. I look at him in terms of he had a country that was really falling apart. He did what he needed to do to keep the country together.
I really think he lived his convictions and did what he thought was needed to be done.
Lincoln was an absolute genius in the sense that he knew that he had to do things in due time, and if he rushed into it, that everything would collapse and there would be no hope of equality for all.
On September 17, 1862, 22,717 soldiers were killed or wounded at a place called Sharpsburg. The Battle of Antietam was the single bloodiest day in American history. Yet, despite immense losses, this battle gave Lincoln the perceived military success he needed to emancipate the slaves.
The risk was significant. And he had to step up to the plate and go deep inside to his heart and know that that was the right thing to do.
Abolitionists in the North, including Frederick Douglass, urged Lincoln and ridiculed Lincoln for not moving fast enough, for not doing it sooner. And Lincoln took a lot of abuse, a lot of heat, a lot of ridicule.
Here's a person who is just so courageous from his youth to his teenage years to his adulthood, and the person who could actually care for people and bring them to another place.
On March 17, 1865, President Lincoln addressed veteran soldiers of the 148th Indiana Regiment. Whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally. 29 days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated.
Ultimately, I think the nation has mourned Lincoln primarily then because he did so much, and collectively as a nation we couldn't thank him.
People like us wouldn't be here if it wasn't for somebody like this.
We want to thank the Henry Ford for allowing us to share this video with our viewers. That's our program for today. Thanks for watching. You can get more information about our guests at AmericanBlackJournal.org. And as always, connect with us on Facebook and on Twitter. Plus, you can now hear our program on WDET 1019 FM. We'll see you next time.
At DTE Energy, we believe that we have a greater responsibility. We believe that being part of a community means being involved in the fabric of that community, investing time, effort, and resources in the communities we serve. DTE Energy Foundation is a proud sponsor of American Black Journal.